Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and today we're looking at Bello, Bard of the Brambles. This is our penultimate Bloomburrow commander from Shirok. Thank you, Shirok, for supporting us and, sending all of these Bloomburrow commanders. They've been a blast to go through. Bello, I didn't really read Bello for a while, but then I played against Bello, I think on MTG Mudsta's channel a while back. And I was kind of blown away about just how powerful they really are and just the fun things you can do with them. And I think this deck already is a really, really fun setup. For everyone who's watching, we're really close to 2,000 subscribers. I'd really like to hit it. It would make me so over the moon. So I hope if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. It would mean the world to me. Finally, I'm gonna probably move around my setup a little bit. I've been changing up my office, so hopefully we'll see some more fun things behind me soon. But until then, let's get into Bello, Bard of the Brambles, and see why they are our commander on our, I don't know how you even, what would you call this? Artifact and enchantment animation deck. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Bello, Bard of the Brambles, and why are they our red-green animating enchantments and artifacts commander? Well, they're a 3/3 Raccoon Bard for 3 in red-green Gruul colors, and they have only one ability, but it is very strong. During your turn, each non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment you control with mana value 4 or greater is a 4/4 elemental creature in addition to its other types and has indestructible, haste, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. That is a lot of text, and I love Magic because it feels so clumsy to see this text, but I know deep down in my heart that any other way of describing would take more time and be not as clear, so we gotta take it as it is. Basically, the whole idea of a deck like this is you get to build around having artifacts that aren't equipment that are 4 mana or greater, and enchantments that are not auras and they're 4 mana and greater. And all of a sudden those creatures are now very strong creatures, while having indestructibility, which is really powerful, and haste, which makes them really good attackers. And then of course when they attack and when they hit, they draw a card. So with that in mind, we tend to want this to be in an aggressive deck. Remember, this only activates on our turns, so our enchantments and auras are just basically not very important when they are not attacking. So when the fact that they are tapped on other turns is usually not so much of a problem. There are some aspects to it we'll go into the deck list, but generally we don't mind. And this also gives us a very straightforward game plan. After we have Bello out, it behooves us to play a 4 mana or greater artifact or enchantment every turn, because immediately comes into play, immediately gets haste, and we attack with it. Ideally, we draw another card, and the turn cycle goes around, and we keep going, right? This is particularly strong, but we're also super we kind of need our commander, right? We're very reliant on our commander because this is such a specific ability that it's really hard to find things that do this in these colors. Like blue has the ability to animate a lot of artifacts, but red and green do not. All right, looking at the deck list itself, it has a lot of things I like, even though there's a few pitfalls I see here and there. Looking at what we always do, our land count is rather low, but our curve isn't that bad. Let's talk about land count. We're at 33 lands, 34 including NDFC. Now, we've got a little bit of pressure off using a game changer Ancient Tomb, but generally, and a few ramp cards, but generally we're rather low on our lands. If we go down here and I click 4 and I'll click any of them, we can see that, where is it? You have a 56% chance of playing these on curve. That doesn't feel particularly good to me. Even if we add both Birds of Paradise and Elvish Mystic, and then even Nature's Lore and 3 Visits into that, I don't think it makes that much of a difference. So I'd really rather we go up to at least 36 lands, 37 including MDFCs, because it's just such a big difference, right? The fact that we need to be dropping these 4-drops in order for our deck to really do anything. So the fact that we can just be held back by that is particularly worrying, right? I guess I didn't include Soul Ring and Arcane Signet in that description, but still, I think it's rather low. Once we get going, we're going to be really, really strong, right? If we live in a world where we get to resolve our commander and cast 1 or 2 of these enchantments, I think we're going to be in a situation where we're immediately drawing maybe, let's say, 1 or 2 extra cards a turn. With that, yes, we'll be able to get the additional lands to keep curving, but I'd rather do that backwards, right? I'd rather have the problem of drawing too many lands while using the extra draws to draw the other impactful cards and even out that way, which means even if we get into a situation that our commander gets hated out, at least we've curved out so that Bello on 5 is still playable. Because I think there is a very real fear that you play Bello on 3, you cast with 4 mana, I don't know, any one of these, let's say Aether Flash, and then we go to attack with it because it has haste and indestructibility, and someone responds by bolting down Bello, and all of a sudden we don't have that card draw engine, right? Because immediately the enchantment turns back into just an enchantment, and now we have to hope to draw that next land, if we don't have it already, to cast Bello again. So that's a real concern of mine. So I want to start off by saying I want at least 3 extra lands in this deck to ensure that we have it. When it comes to the curve, I don't mind this so much. I think there's a lot of pressure on 4, but that makes sense. This is the core cast of the core aspect of our deck, is to be able to cast these cards. And I think there is an argument that we should be a little more, let's say, critical of the cards in here because of that. But I don't think it makes that much of a difference, because no matter what we do, this is going to be the slot that has the most cards. 5 having quite a few is a bit tricky, but understandable, because there's still a lot of cards that we particularly like. And then looking down here, we have a lot of really strong enchantments. We'll get back to creatures in a second. 6, we're going down. 7, we're still going down. And 9, which is Portal to Phyrexia, is the only real 9 mana card, whereas Great Henge most of the time we're going to be, so 4, that's 3, so we'll probably be casting it for 5. Blasphemous Act as well is obviously not a card that's particularly cast at 9 mana, but due to the majority of our creatures being indestructible, it's not the worst thing to Blasphemous Act, though we lose our commander and all of our enchantments and artifacts stop being creatures. So, looking at the deck list itself, a few things that come to mind. The first thing I want to start with is actually, coming back down here, is our 3 mana slot. So this is a rather interesting place to be, right? The first situation is that our 3 mana slot kind of has a bit of a nombo with our commander. 3 mana cards just do not do what the commander needs them to do because they are 1 mana too short. And on the same end, they are competing with our 3 mana commander for that slot. And you might even say, but Curse, I have a few 1 mana cards, Birds of Paradise and Elvish Mystic here, that allow us to play Bello on turn 2, which allows us to, like, you know, play our 3 mana cards as well very quickly. But of course that argument falls apart because the next turn you want to play a 4 mana card and immediately get Bello going. So I just, like, right away, I have some problems with this amount of cards. However, some of them I think are rather good. Going from enchantments, Aggravated Assault is incredibly powerful with this deck. In fact, you will notice there's a lot of take extra combat steps in this deck, which makes sense. Any deck that's able to attack with a number of creatures and draw cards off of their damage benefits from another attack, because it will just further and further increase that lead. And especially by having indestructible creatures, we're in the situation where all of the damage that's done to our creatures by blockers just does not matter. So we're incentivized to attack over and over again, hopefully knocking out our opponents in one go. I will take a moment for someone who might be looking at the deck and is a little confused of why we have things such as Vitalize. We use those, or things that untap our lands as well. We use these in conjunction with those abilities, because cards such as Sisay's Ring and Thran Dynamo, which are 4/4 creatures, can then be untapped to produce the mana we need in order to cast our subsequent take another combat spells. So aggravated assault, I get. Shared animosity, I think, is also good. I feel like there's this in Coat of Arms, and I don't particularly like either of them. I'm not going to say take them out because I understand the ceiling on this, but let's do our card evaluation bit. If you've watched my recent video on card evaluation, I really recommend you do. You might already be ahead on this. Shared Animosity and both this and Coat of Arms give us a creature bonus to our power depending on how many of the same creature type we have. The idea here, of course, is that all of our 4 mana artifacts and enchantments that aren't auras or equipment are elementals. So each of them will get a bonus there. Now, the way this works is kind of tricky because they both look at other creatures, not the total number of creatures. I don't know why they were coded this way, but it's just how it is. So if you have 5 elementals attacking, they each get +4/+0 or +4/+4 with Coat of Arms. And what I'm going to suggest is that this falls, if we do our little quadrant theory, right? When this card is good, is it good when we're neutral? Is it good when we're ahead? Is it good when we're behind? And is it good when we are have our commander out? And I would say both of these cards are only really good with our commander out and when we're ahead, right? At neutral, at least a perceived neutral, where yes, you might have a ton of 4/4s, but your opponents have a bunch of like ghostly prisons or the like to impede your ability to attack, I would consider that to be neutral. This card isn't good. Or if you just don't have a lot of enchantments or artifacts to make into bodies, and that's neutral or behind, this card is still not good. So you need to have a bunch of creature enchantments or creature artifacts that will attack, that are all elementals, and your commander has to be out, because if it's not out, none of this can ever happen. That to me is the definition of win more. I think if you're attacking with 4 4/4s, attacking with 4 7/4s really does not make that much of a difference. They're already indestructible, they already draw you cards. It's the difference between putting one opponent to almost being knocked out versus, you know, just attacking them and doing like half of their health. That to me is just not worth it, and I personally would take out both of these cards. I'll leave it up to you. On the other hand, Garruk Uprising and Tribute to the World Tree are both card advantage engines based on the fact that your enchantments and your artifacts will come in at 4 power and trigger these cards to draw you cards. Now we have several of these. We've got Tribute of the World Tree, we have Garruk's Uprising, we have over here Guardian Project. In addition, we have our Commander and Oran Frostfang and Toski. All of these are card draw engines that, to be fair, I do really, really like, but we may be overdoing it a bit. I would probably cut the creature ones, which is probably the thing I was going to get back to, is that I think we have too many creatures that don't really do anything. Like, don't get me wrong, Toski is very, very cool, but is reliant on our deck functioning to get that text, where that text already exists on our commander. So do we really need it? I do like that they're also indestructible, but still. Same thing with Oran Frostfang. Do we really need our 4/4s to have Death Touch? And do we need that line of text that our commander already has? Kind of tricky to say. So I would really, really like to cut one of these, and I'd like it to be harmonized. You know, 4 mana, draw 3 cards. Just something that doesn't rely on our deck to be functioning to draw us cards that we can use midway through the game or in neutral or when we're behind to figure out an answer. Likewise, I think there is, you'll have to excuse me, the card that draws you for each creature you have, and then gains you 4 life for each ferocious creature. You could probably still play that and that'd be fine. I'm not a huge fan, but having just some card draw that isn't dependent on damage or creatures coming into play might help, but I don't have a huge problem with this. Angel's Trumpet feels cute. I think it's fine. I don't think it's necessary here, but I'm not gonna fight you too much. Mithril Coat, also fine. I don't particularly love it. but it's fine. I get why it's in here. Works with Blasphemous Act, works with our commander, that's fine. Swords of Feast and Famine is now I'm starting to have a really hard time. This card is really, really good when it works, and when it's not good, it's just okay. We just don't have a lot of low power creatures or the ability to invest our mana into attaching it and then guaranteeing that hit, right? Your opponent's going to work really, really hard to block this creature. And don't get me wrong, the fact that the creature you attach it to is indestructible will make up for that. But that also creates this kind of problem where we weren't worried about green or black removal because both of them tend to destroy or deal damage. So we were more afraid of white removal with exile or blue removal with bounce. So I'd rather have a sword that protects from those things rather than green and black. But we're using this for the untap all lands text to go infinite with our infinite combat steps. I understand the mentality. I think it's somewhat unnecessary because this deck already goes pretty crazy without much effort. Otherwise, looking at the deck itself, I think there's still a few things that I find a little tricky. Goreclaw is here because when it attacks, each creature with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and trample until end of turn. I'm going to suggest something that's similar to that and is not a creature, so it works better with Bello. I suppose something we should take a moment to talk about is whether a deck like this wants to go all in with their commander. And I would probably argue yes. I know it is a tricky thing to do. It's like the equivalent of when someone has a graveyard deck and says, how do I beat Rest in Peace? Well, sometimes you can't beat Rest in Peace, right? And I think this is one of those situations. Though one of my additions will address this. As a whole, if your opponents really, really hate Bello, you're probably not going to be able to play the game. Now, they're going to have to put a lot of effort and resources into doing that, of constantly keeping Bello off the battlefield, and while dodging things like asceticism, which protect Bello, they're going to be working really hard, but they might still succeed, which is tricky. So it's just something I think you have to make peace with and accept the fact that Bello might just get counterspelled out of the game, and that's it. Doesn't mean that the deck is bad, doesn't mean like it's not a good fit for the deck and a good strategy. I think it's just something that this deck has to jump over, a hurdle of sorts that other decks may not need, because there's really nothing that simulates Bello's ability in this deck. There's just nothing that'll do it. We can simulate aspects of Bello, but we can't simulate that really, really important first half that turns those creatures, those enchantments and artifacts into creatures. So with that in mind, cards like Goreclaw kind of catch me as not being very, very good. Outcast Trailblazer just feels a weaker version of Guardian Project in a deck like this. Despite that, Outcast Trailblazer is 4 power, which is something I like. Universally, you're still going to prefer an enchantment such as Guardian Project over it because, well, it becomes a creature and it's indestructible and it has haste and it's a 4/4 and it draws a card on attack, whereas Outcast or Trailblazer is probably just more like an equivalent, like what the 5th or 6th version of Garruk's Uprising. Like, definitely there's better cards before that. The rest I don't want to pick on too much because generally they're good. Lumra feels okay. I think this is a flavor inclusion because it's on Bloomburrow, and though I really do like Lumra, I like Lumra more in a modern deck that uses that ability to combo off and win, and less so as kind of a strange value piece that represents being a really good, really big creature. I get that, but still will need assistance to get trample or any other evasion onto them in order to get those attacks in. So with that in mind, not very impressed, but that's fine. Okay, is there anything else that really catches my eye? Not really. Nothing that I see that makes me shudder in revulsion. I think a lot of these choices are really, really good, and especially with these higher mana, like 5 mana and higher artifacts and enchantments, I get why they're in here, and there's really nothing that's going to replace most of these. Like Molten Echoes is a card that is really, really hard to, I meant Mana Echoes. That's not the Echoes, M Echoes. Mana Echoes is a card that's almost impossible to have anything compare to it. So there's no point looking through these and saying, what can we find to replace them? Because I think they're fine. But what do I have as additions? Let's go straight into that. Speaking of the kind of stress on your commander, I feel like this is one of those commander decks that really benefits from Myth Unbound. Myth Unbound is one of those cards that is really strong, but really niche. I think when this came out, a lot of people were impressed by the fact that it does something that seems to bend the rules of Commander itself, having the Commander tax. But that being said, it really doesn't see play as much as people thought it would. And I agree with this because it's generally not that great of a card. However, here is one of those places that I think it does really well because your commander is your deck is dependent on your commander. So Myth Unbound stopping your commander from going 3 mana, 5 mana, 7 mana, and instead going 3 mana, 4 mana, 5 mana, so on, is really important. And that extra card draw here and there is really nice. Unfortunately, it is a 3 mana enchantment. There's not much I can say about that. I wish it wasn't, but it is, and therefore cannot attack. However, some may say that's fine because then you can't Swords to Plowshare as this card, but it is what it is. I do really like that here. If we were in black, there's another option in there, and there's also, I believe, the land that pulls your commander from your command zone into your hand. Are we playing that? I have to assume we're not. No. If we were, we definitely could. This is a deck that could do that because, once again, reliant on our commander. A card that's not even out yet at the time of making this video, but one that really catches my eye is Encroaching Dragonstorm, because this has the text that I really like to see on a permanent, and it is the put 2 lands into play for 4 mana text that green has. Almost universally, this was always on sorceries. Then they put it on a battle, and I'm not sure if we can find it on anything else, but I took a look looking for an enchantment, and Encroaching Dragonstorm is the one we want. Now, of course, this is secondary language here of when a dragon you control enters, return this enchantment to its owner's hand. You can just ignore that. I'm pretty sure you don't play any dragons to begin with. I'm just looking at the big flying birds. Oh, you do. Dragonhawk is a dragon. I wasn't sure about that. So you do have one example of it. However, I don't think you're gonna be too mad about that because the triggers can be set up that you still get the benefit, and then you can cast this again later in order to get the effect again. But for me, it's just so simply play this, ramp 2 cards onto the battlefield, and then with your commander out, this is also a 4/4 attacker that of all your attackers, of all your enchantments, you care about the least. Something that's worth considering is a lot of the enchantments you have and artifacts are very powerful, and therefore will be sniped down by your opponents. Something like Encroaching Dragonstorm, you never need to worry about that because they're just not going to do that. And while they're leaving the Dragonstorm uninterfered with and worrying more about Bello, you can just attack with this with impunity without worrying about, ways that it might be removed, right? And I do really like that. And likewise, I wanted to suggest Solemn Simulacrum, Sad Robot Themselves. This is a card that I've brought up that it doesn't really have a place in Commander anymore, though it was for long time considered a staple. We're now in this age that it's just kind of a bad card, even at lower power. However, I still stand by the fact that if you have ways of exploiting this ability, such as reanimating it a bunch, blinking a bunch, reducing its mana cost so it costs less, creating copies of it, and the like, this isn't too bad of a card. And if you just saw, if you were paying attention with the last card, you understand completely why I think this card is rather good here. Because you get a 4/4 attacker. Remember, all it says is an artifact that isn't equipment. It doesn't ask if the creature is a creature itself. Just that on your turn, it becomes a 4/4 elemental creature in addition to its other types. So this then becomes a 4/4 and has the same amount of text and the same relevant abilities, but it got you a basic land card on the battlefield in the meantime, getting you from 4 to 5 and bringing you closer to 8, where 8 is probably the mana cost you really want to hit, or what should I say? The mana amount you really want to hit, because it represents casting 2 more 4 mana spells in 1 turn. So I like this. It's a nice package. When it dies, you draw a card. That's always been a line of text I particularly like. Of course, with Indestructible, it's not going to die, but should you need a blocker, it's there for that. Remember, of course, that Bello does not allow him to be a 4/4 on your turn, so if it blocks, it is just a 2/2 without Indestructible. Likewise, another artifact creature that really caught my eye is Giggling Skitterspike. Now, this is an interesting creature because it is a stuffy doll variant that is a little different than the other stuffy doll variants. This comes in with Indestructible. It's a 1/1, add 4 mana, and whenever it attacks, blocks, or becomes a target of a spell, it then deals its damage equal to its power to each opponent. What that means, fundamentally for you, is that when you play this and Bello is out, it is a 4/4, you attack and deal 12 damage, 4 for each opponent, immediately. Now, that blocks line is probably not going to come up, but there is a reasonable chance that it's going to become the target of a spell. Now, probably not by you. Unlike the other stuffy doll variants, you don't want to really hit this with damage, but it could still be used. Like, if you can get those last points of damage in by targeting with something, it's still something you could do conceivably. And the fact that it is a triggered ability, it will always go through. The last aspect of this that I really do like is the Monstrous, because that makes it a 9/9 with the bonus, because these are counters, right? So all of a sudden it's a 9/9, it attacks, it does 27 damage, and then of course whoever it attacks has to block, is really impressive, and I do really like this card. Yeah, I just generally like this card. I think this is a very good inclusion. Coming into some enchantments, a few that caught my eye. Gruul War Chant I like a lot more than a lot of these other, coat of arms effects, because this also gives evasion. This gives your attacking creatures menace. Now, I like menace more than trample in a deck like this, because 1, increases the chances that you will get attacks in, damage in, if you have enough creatures versus your opponent's enough creatures. Whereas trample, if they have a few really tall creatures, they can block you out. Whereas menace requires them to have a lot of creatures. And I would say, and maybe this is just me and the pods I play in, it is more likely to find an opponent with few creatures than it is likely to find an opponent with low toughness creatures. Does that make sense? Maybe that's really dependent on games, but I would say I tend to see people with more a grouping of 5/5s, of 3 or 4 5/5s, than 10 1/1s. And this is good against the 10 1/1s. And sorry, this is good against the several 5/5s, whereas the other way, if you had trample, would be better. Here, menace is also a ability that green-red does struggle to get sometimes. It's mainly in black-red, so it's nice for you to have access to it, and I think it's just going to be better. All this to say, of course, it's a 4-mana enchantment, so it itself attacks, becomes a 5/4, has menace, and you're really happy. Flame Shadow Conjuring is another one that I think is really cool here, because this enables you to get extra copies of certain abilities. Flame Shadow Conjuring says basically you Splinter Twin when a non-token creature you control enters. And obviously if your enchantments are entering as creatures, you pay red, you get another 4/4, and if that enchantment was, for example, I say enchantment, it could be artifact, it could have been Solemn Simulacrum, it could be Encroaching Dragonstorm, you get that ATB as well. That's not even including if it's something like Gruul War Chant, where you get even more of a bonus. For a deck that wants to stay around or get to that 4 mana and 5 mana zone, Flame Shadow Conjuring kind of giving you a bonus for having an additional mana here and there, I think is really good. Namely, I would say, because like I said before, 4 mana and 8 mana are kind of like your big zones, and this gives relevance to all of the little dashes in between. It even makes 6 good, because you could play a 5-drop and have an additional mana for this. I think it makes a very big difference in how you use your mana on your turn and give you even more explosive turns, right? Because that one red mana represents another ETB or another bonus static effect, and I think it should, but not always, it represents another card you'll draw with the damage you'll do, right? And I think that's very, very worthwhile. It's also important that these copies don't evaporate on the end of combat, so this works really, really well with your additional combat steps because you get to keep them for longer, and once you have ridiculous amounts of mana, you can trigger this multiple times with multiple enchantments or artifacts, enabling you to get further and further ahead in one colossal move. I think this is a really, really good card. Like, I think this is probably one of the best cards for a deck like this. One that I saw that I thought was worth mentioning is Glorious Sunrise, very much so for that text that says, on the beginning of your combat, your turn, creatures you control have +1/+1 and gain trample. I said earlier for Menace, now we're talking about trample. So I know Goreclaw does this, but I think this is just a little better. Obviously, it's got two other modes that I particularly like, giving you a little extra mana, and also drawing you a card if you control a creature with power 3 or greater, which by definition you should. And who cares about the gain life? Of course, beginning of combat is another really key feature, and not like, beginning of upkeep, because this enables us once again, if we are taking multiple combats in a row, we're going to get this to trigger multiple times. I think, honestly, all of these are good to trigger multiple times. Obviously, the creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample is one you only want to really trigger once, because after that point, it's not really, it's the trample you want. The +1/+1's kind of secondary, but being able to draw more than one card potentially, or at least just that trample and the card, I think is really, really good. The other two modes I think are not as important, but you can use that target land gains +3 tap for 3 green mana to push you over the edge to use an extra combat turn, which can be useful as well. I'm not a big math person for something like this, but I think it is rather strong. Overlord of the Hauntwoods. Now, I wanted to talk about this for a second with a really big caveat. And the really big caveat is this. The way Impending and the Theros gods work is very specific with Bello. Basically, whichever one, because they all have modes that say, this is not a creature unless, and Bello says, this is a creature. So how do we resolve this? It's timestamping, and now this is a big rules thing that not everyone learns, so I'm going to simplify it with the sense that whatever effect is last is the one that's going to take priority. So if you play Overlord of the Hauntwoods prior to Bello, Bello's ability is going to be the one that matters to turn Overlord of the Hauntwoods into a 4/4. But if you have Bello out and you cast Overlord of the Hauntwoods on its Impending, then the Impending ability will be the one in, struggling to describe this, will be the one in effect, and therefore it will not be a 4/4 despite it is a 4 mana enchantment. Does that make sense? This is true for a lot of more complex things. I think like Blood Moon effects and the like do this kind of stuff when something turns into one kind of land and then turns into another kind of land with static effects. But generally, just like the stack, there's this kind of importance of the last one on the stack or the last ability applied. With here, it's timestamps, so whatever comes out last is the one that affects. Good, great. So with that in mind, I still want to suggest Overlord. You will have to play that kind of game of memory of reteaching you and maybe your opponents exactly how the timestamping work, but besides that, I think it's still really worthwhile playing. One, it does a pretty good impression of how your commander deck is supposed to work by having a creature that's an enchantment, or let me rephrase, an enchantment that becomes a creature with a pretty good ability, but of course, it does it in kind of a weird way. Now, Overlord of the Hauntwoods is really, really good because it'll give you lands, and this deck needs mana. As a Titan, it's going to trigger both on enchantment and attack. Enter the battlefield and attack, but with Bello, this is actually kind of complicated to do. With timestamps, that means we have to play the Overlord and then the Bello, which means what we need is 6 mana to get the full triggers. Because if we play Overlord on Impending, play Bello, Overlord becomes a 4/4, attacks right away. That means we've gotten 2 tapped everywhere tokens, which is really, really cool. But that's a lot of things that have to happen in a particular order, right? We have to have 3 mana and not cast Bello, which is probably a mistake. Or we have to have 6 mana and cast this, then Bello, which then makes me ask, why didn't you cast Bello before when you had less than 6 mana? That makes no sense. Maybe you were remanded, maybe you were reprieved, sure, but I don't think that's particularly going to happen. I think much more realistically, a lot of situations are going to be that you're going to just cast the Overlord after Bello is in play. And ideally, you will cast the Overlord for 5, get those two land tokens by playing it. It gets hasted and indestructible. It is a 4/4, but then you get to attack with it. But there's going to be worlds where you just cast it on Impending and say, whatever, in 4 turns, I'll get my Overlord. This clunkiness does not make it a worse card. This is still a really, really good card. And it has that kind of text that, once again, I really like, where it works with the deck and puts lands into play. Of course, unlike the other ones like Sad Robot and the Dragonstorm, it creates the lands, but that doesn't make it any less good, and that's something I particularly like. As someone who plays Black-White Blink and blinks the black Overlord in Modern, let me tell you, it's good stuff. The Overlords are really, really strong. Ask a Standard player how good the Overlords are. They're very, very strong. So I would suggest for sure, if you have the means to play this card, play it. I think it's clunky at worst, but at middle, it's great. It's really, really great. Coming into removal a little bit, I wanted to point out that we're kind of low on removal, and I wouldn't mind a few pieces. Cards like Nature's Claim is always, always good. And of course, Lightning Bolt, my dear child. I would like Lightning Bolt to be played in a deck like this. You could probably go further. You could probably play 2 to 3 more removal spells in the colors. You could probably play a few fights with a very low opportunity cost due to the nature of having 4/4 indestructible creatures. But I still think you need to play a few. This deck is a very, very aggressive deck, and it benefits very much so by having everyone else on the back foot. But that doesn't mean it doesn't benefit you to have this removal. And just kind of like how I was talking about the copying enchantment, there's going to be a lot of turns where you've got 1 or 2 mana left over with nothing meaningful to do with them, and being able to instead direct that 1 or 2 mana into some lower mana removal spells, I think will be very, very worthwhile. And that is my additions, and that is my opinions on the deck. I think this deck is really, really cool. I think if you play this in a group, it'll definitely develop a reputation. I think there's nothing wrong with that, but be aware, this deck, when it is strong, is unbelievably strong. And when it is weak, it's fine. This is a great deck to teach your playgroup to pack removal. That's maybe something I should say about this. If you're feeling that your playgroup is playing at a level where they're not removing commanders and they're just letting everyone do their thing, i.e. what I imagine most pickup groups at like a local game store are like, play Bello. You can educate them by their losses that they really should pack some removal, that they really should keep in mind what their opponent's commanders are and not let them do whatever they want, right? And I think that's overall good for the environment you're in, if you want that. I'm trying to choose my words very carefully here because I do know a lot of players do enjoy that level of commander where nobody plays removal and everyone's picking up their toys and smashing them against each other. I do not, but that doesn't mean you have to hate on them. However, if you're with a play group and you've suggested it and they don't believe you that they need to run more removal, maybe play Bello. If you have like $800 to spend on a deck like this, it's just an $800 lesson for your friends. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this video was very helpful. Thank you, Shirok, for sending the deck, and good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe. I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.